Welcome to the podcast, Abbie.
Thank you.
Starting off, what do you actually do?
Right, so I'm an environmental economist, which is probably a job title that most people don't stumble across in their lifetime. So what that really means, I guess, is about how we capture the environment, whether that be impacts or ways that we can manage and protect the environment within our economy. So particularly in developed nations, Western democracies and so on, organisations, private sector and public government organisations are always really focused on the financial bottom line. It's not that they don't care about other things, it's really hard to ignore those dollar signs. And the problem when it comes to managing the environment is that most things to do with the environment are not within a marketplace. We don't buy and sell a koala in the same way that we buy food, clothes or a car. So we need to be a little bit more creative about the ways we integrate those environmental values into our decision making.
That, like you said, that's quite a kind of a bit of a niche. How did you end up in that role?
Yeah, well, that's an interesting question. To be honest, I just fell into it. So back when I was studying my undergraduate degree, which was actually a Bachelor of Science in Natural Resource Management, and that was at UWA, within that sort of first year, we started to take some economic courses. And what I really started to understand there is that, you know, I've always been quite passionate about the environment and want to find the ways that we can best manage it and protect our wildlife and so on. But recognising that, you know, people like to do things, consume things, and we have growing populations who are going to have increasing needs. We need to grow food somewhere, we need to build houses somewhere, all of those sorts of issues. That we need to find the ways to balance that, and economics is a really useful way to integrate all sorts of information together and manage that information and to be able to prioritise the way that we use our natural resources, basically.
Yeah, that makes sense. Going from studying science and then doing some economics in there, what's that like? Does it feel like you're switching the side of your brain, or is it quite similar in some ways?
Well, yeah, quite similar really. So economics is known as what we call a social science rather than the other more traditional forms of science like our biophysical sciences, ecology and engineering and all of those sorts of things. But it's actually, and it's a social science because it's about the study of people and their behaviour. But it's actually very quantitative, so mathematical and so on, statistical. So in that sense, it's not that different to a lot of the statistics that you would use in scientific-based approaches anyway. So we tend to work quite well with scientists, and we do that a lot. One of the things that we often come up against are that people, particularly sort of your environmental NGOs or other sort of, you know, very pro-environmental people, can be a little bit apprehensive about using economic frameworks because they're worried about converting everything into dollars and thinking, you know, well, I know how important this particular animal is to, you know, the functioning of an ecosystem, but the rest of the community doesn't, so why would they value it? And that, you know, we don't want to use economics because it'll just ignore it, and it's not going to be protected if we do that. What we tend to see when we do these surveys are that the general community are actually pretty smart and clued on, and although they might use different words to describe ecosystem function and those sorts of things, they get it. Yeah. They understand the importance and interconnectedness of everything, and they do want to protect it. And so we tend to see quite large values come out of these things, and certainly large enough to compete with, you know, the value of some major development or something like that. So I think that really we need to sort of flip our thinking and try out some of these frameworks a bit more often, because a lot of the time they'll probably come out in favour of protecting the environment.
What has a higher cost, a cyclone or a volcano?
Oh, yeah, I don't know because I haven't estimated that, but I'm going to guess probably cyclones just because they're more frequent and they tend to come across more heavily populated areas where you've got people, you tend to have more costs. But that's a guess.
It's a good guess. That is a very good guess. We often ask people, would you rather work with animals or people? But for you, we have a different one, which is, would you rather work with scientists or economists?
Well, I mean, to be honest, I spend most of, I was going to say definitely animals. I can answer that. I'll answer both. No, but we spend a lot of time working with scientists, particularly in our centre. We're very applied and try to work across disciplines, if you like. So, yeah, I really enjoy that. You know, my background was originally science, and yeah, I like the idea of being able to translate or understand how the economic research works with the scientific research and what that means at the end of the day in terms of impact on the environment.
Do you think some scientists, do they have any kind of apprehension to making that conversion? Are they ever like, no, this is my science just for the science?
Yeah, we tend to see kind of, I guess, two camps of thought in the scientific discipline, and particularly in ecology. And I would say probably the majority, at least, you know, it might be a bit biased, it might just be the ones that I work with have this perspective, and maybe I'm missing the other ones. But we tend to see that most of them are actually quite keen on this idea of being able to evaluate environmental impacts in monetary terms, because they understand that without that bit of information, a lot of environmental impacts are missed from decision making. They're talked about, but they're not really thought about when you know, key decision makers have to make an ultimate decision about what they're going to do. So I think for the most part they see the logic in that. There are some who really believe in this concept of intrinsic value, which is the value of a plant existing for its own existence. It's not the value that we place on the plant existing, because that we can capture in economics. It's purely the value of the plant, its own value for its own existence. And that's not something we can capture in an economic framework. And that's just a really interesting philosophical debate. If people weren't here, would it matter if the plant existed? I don't know.
And we're always putting a certain level of human understanding on top of that as well.
Exactly. Yeah. So that's a I guess people who really believe in that concept of intrinsic value really struggle with the concept of using economics,
because they're kind of the opposite.
Yeah. I mean, economics is you know, it's a human-based perspective.
Yeah. And to finish up, I would love to know what your favourite fun fact you've ever learnt in your area of expertise is.
Fun fact. Well, I mean, I don't know. I tend to work in a space that's actually quite concerning in terms of, you know, dealing with environmental impact.
That's completely fair.
But I think maybe a fun fact is actually something that I just experienced right at the beginning of my career, and it relates back to one of your questions about sort of how big are people's willingness to pay for protecting the environment and things like that, and the concerns that some people might have that, you know, maybe we shouldn't use economic frameworks because we might not quite accurately represent the value people have for these things. In my honours year, I did a research project where we looked at the value of seascapes in Jurien Bay, and obviously being an honours project, you know, probably wasn't quite best practice methodology, but we constructed this really hypothetical scenario, which was that we were going to put a wind farm in the sand dunes or out in the ocean, and that people could opt to pay some sort of amount of money to move that inland so that it didn't disrupt their beautiful ocean view. And, you know, so that all went fine. But sitting in the pub afterwards, talking to some of the locals, they actually believed the hypothetical scenario a bit too well, and they actually thought that the government was going to come in and construct these wind turbines, and that was definitely happening.
No.
And, you know, I think that they got a little bit, you know, of a stronger view about that than what pints of beer that they had. So I couldn't convince them otherwise. And so I think sometimes the concern that people have for, I guess, the hypothetical nature of some of these surveys is maybe a bit overstated, because I found it hard to convince them it was hypothetical.
Even though you came up with it.
Yes, it was entirely hypothetical in this case.
Wow, that's fantastic. That's a great story. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast today. That was fascinating.
No worries, thank you.